Hi everyone, welcome to the Film Rehash. I am Paolo Quiros, creator of the film Reroll. This is a new segment I'm creating for the Patreon to talk about the show and, how I prepare for it, what are things that can happen, what's the experience of doing it, and maybe talk about the movies themselves, what makes them good for the show or bad for the show in some cases. So we're going to do one of these per movie that we did. So this is our Back to the Future 2 segment. I'm first going to talk a little bit about, the show itself and how it came to be and there came to exist a first episode. I've actually thought to myself that because it's, a lot of podcasts, there's like a marketing engine behind them when they start and it's like, they've budgeted 12 episodes and they have money. And this was really just an idea that we had. And if that first episode hadn't been good, I don't know that the show would have existed, Like, I was like, I think this concept will work. And then we did Back to the Future 2, and I was like, yeah, I think this concept really does work. I really enjoyed that. But if I had, done a different movie and it had, just been boring, I think I would have been like, no, I guess that does... I don't know. I think the show still would have happened. I think we could have forgiven ourselves a bad episode or two. But anyway, the first episode being one that I really enjoyed was really critical to getting the show moving forward at the, energy that it did. The original inspiration for the show is actually me. It's a memory that sticks with me to this day, watching Ghostbusters as a very small kid. And at the end, when they're on the roof with Zool and she's like, "Are you gods?" Or "Are you a god?" I don't remember what the exact line is. And one of them, I forget which one, says, no, and then she's like, "Then die!" and, shoots them with her god lasers. And then, I forget which one says, "When someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes." And I have this distinct memory of thinking, what would have happened if they'd said yes? Like, what's the next line in that scene when you're talking to a god and that god thinks that you're a god? And also, it's fascinating to me that she asks. That implies that gods can't just tell if you're a god. Anyway, I have many questions about that, and we will do Ghostbusters eventually, although I don't know if we're making it to that scene. So I've always had that fascination with drawing outside the lines. Like, what else is going on in the movie? When I love Lord of the Rings, obviously, I love Lord of the Rings. Yeah, I'm a nerd. Obviously, I love Lord of the Rings. And I'm always fascinated by what's off the edges of the map. What's in Far Harad, So that's the show that I was creating, is what happens when you color outside the edges of these stories. And then the other thing is, I'm now a grown-up human. I'm an actor, and figuring out how stories work and what the roles of the characters in the story are is sort of my job. So that's kind of how the show came to be. And then it was just a matter of... Well, and then the other ingredient was... So I did not play role-playing games as a kid. That's just, I was never exposed to them until 5 years ago when Peter from the show, comes up to me in a bar and says, "Do you want to play Dungeons and Dragons?" And I was like, "Sure." And so he got John from the show, to DM a campaign, and I really enjoyed it. And also it was a bunch of, theater people, or at least performing arts people. And getting all those people who are whose job is to put together stories, Andy was also in that campaign, was, for me really incredible. It was a different form of collective storytelling. There wasn't a script, there was a scenario, and then it was up to you to kind of create the story, but not like improv in the sense that you can't just decide the nature of reality. The way that improv works usually is reality has kind of a loose basis because anyone can just take what they want from it. You can just pull any thread, "Oh, I had a gun this whole time." And for me, less interesting than the mechanics of how swordplay works, and that was fascinating. you are each playing one of the characters in the story, but you are constrained by the collective reality, which is a tool. It's like anything, a limitation is a tool in storytelling. So from that game, I had always wanted to figure out a way to use that, to get a bunch of actors and writers and performers in a room and use role-playing games as a vehicle for a story. Obviously, I'm not the first person to think of that idea, but for me, the missing ingredient then was the movie thing, because now we have an agreed-upon structure that the audience also already knows, and we have the additional fun of it being kind of a movie conversation podcast. You know, we're talking about the aspects of Jaws that we enjoyed, or, you know, Back to the Future that we enjoyed. So, I got a group together. Peter, who is a theater director and just generally a smart guy and a very funny guy, and he himself is very much a performer, even though he's not professionally a performer. Sort of the structure of all of us kind of talking about movies, that's something we already were doing in our daily lives, so, you know, Peter was natural in it. Andy as well. Andy is one of the wittiest people I know. He's an incredible writer. He just has a gift for character and how stories work. And obviously I'd played with him already. Jaws, who was the only one of the original group who I hadn't played D&D with, but she's an incredibly talented actor. Seriously, like, you know, I say this about everyone, but Jaws is an incredible actor. If you have the opportunity to go see her on stage, you should, because she's really gifted and always crazy creative, and someone who kind of thinks in a sort of off-kilter way. I just thought that she'd bring the spark of creativity to the show that she did bring. And John, who is not a performer, but was, back when I first met him, back in college, he was an actor. Now he's, you know, he has a real job, but he is an RPG expert, which I thought we also needed on the show, along with his obvious charm and talent as a performer. So that was the original group. Andy, even though he wasn't on Back to the Future 2 and not in the first few episodes, he was always intended to be a starting member of the show. He was just, you know, being a writer not in New York at the time, so that was our original crew, and the first episode came to be, and I was going to do Back to the Future, but I realized that it doesn't, like, we didn't have Andy, and so I had 3 people, and I was like, you can't really do it with 3. You can do it with 2, with just Marty and Doc, or you could do it with 4, with the mom and the dad as PCs, but it felt awkward for me to do it as 3, and then I realized that the Back to the Future 2 day was coming up or had already happened, so Back to the Future 2 made sense. My idea for, and, you know, at this point, I don't have any idea how well this is going to work, so I'm totally guessing at what's going to work and what's not going to work, but I chose Back to the Future because of all the, like, time travel shenanigans that are possible. Like, I wanted to get into that, and the possibility of this, like, really open-endedness. Like, all of time is available to you, too. I had a mechanic for, like, if they failed their time machine operation rolls, you travel back to you dice roll, and depending on the margin of failure, you can go really far forward or really far backwards in time. So on a crit fail, you could end up, any when. So I wanted to have fun with that. And the core mechanic of that movie, of Biff manipulating the time continuum and it leading to a reality in which Biff is like this super powerful business guy and everything. Not to get into the political situation, but a very Donald Trumpish figure. Was, for me, a cool storytelling hook in that, like, the movie establishes that you can manipulate time very directly. So if Doc wants to go back and make himself rich, he can, and you can, if you end up in a situation where you can mess with the time continuum purposefully, you can go back and like, take out what the other, like this character does this thing, you can directly, mess with that. And like in most time travel movies, you can't just do that, right? There's like, either it's the butterfly effect thing where you just, who knows what'll happen, or you can't just manipulate events and they immediately happen. Or like Terminator style where you can't really go back and forth, you just go back. So you can't see the effects. So that, for me, for a game, was a fun time travel mechanic, and I really wanted to play with the aspect of them, like, anything can happen. Like, I think in the joke he makes in the episode, Peter makes a joke about, like, ending up in the 70s, but that's something that I was thinking, like literally, I wanted any time to be a possibility, and we would have to, like, kind of play with that, improvise with that new scenario, which could have been really fun. What did happen was insane and fun, and I loved it. But we didn't get into like the more complex aspects of what the plot mechanics of that movie could have lent us. The paradox mechanic for me was kind of actually a little bit of an afterthought, in the sense that I was like, so I was thinking about like, all the ways that you can manipulate the time stream and mess with, like, Biff went back and did this. Well, what if we go back before him and do this and stop that, So all those time travel mechanics that I wanted to get into, I also wanted to provide something to kind of limit them so you can't go totally insane. And that's what the paradox rules were actually meant to do, was just sort of put a check on how crazy you can go with the time stream, which for me made perfect sense and is established by the movie. So I created those, and it was pretty slow to get started, but once it started going, the effects could get deadly fairly quickly. What I didn't expect was, of course, what actually happened in the movie, where they don't actually time travel to any other time. They don't make it out of 2015. They just mess about with meeting their other selves enough times to start triggering some paradox rolls, and they got a little unlucky with the nature of the rolls they got. There's 3 separate tables of effects, so as you start doing more paradoxes and the penalties get higher, you trigger the higher tables depending on your rolls, and each one has a bunch of different possible effects. But so it was all, sort of randomized and scaled to get harder and harder. And of course they kept triggering things that kept undoing their work. John believes that the paradox rules were too harsh, but I actually think that they were just perfect in terms of, like, they got a little bit unlucky, and also they were very much mucking about. And they paid the price, the ultimate price. So yeah, that was Back to the Future 2. We had a ton of fun making it, and I'm so glad that it went as well as it did. It was a very slapdash operation compared to now. I mean, both in, like, the level of preparation that I had. I basically watched the movie twice. I came up with a few mechanics, and I was like, all right, I'm going to, this movie is so wide open in terms of where they could end up that I just have to be ready to improvise, which I always do have to be ready to improvise. But I didn't really prepare much specific stuff in terms of just, this is the movie, playing it. And it went pretty well. And also very slapdash in terms of just, like, technically, we weren't there yet in terms of how we produced the show. And none of us really, other than John at that point, totally knew the rules very well. The GURPS mechanics rules, it's the system that we use to run the game. And so yeah, Back to the Future 2. And that's my film rehash for that one. Leave any comments about what kinds of stuff you'd like me to talk about, and if you have any questions, and I'll just answer those as well. And yeah, thanks for listening to the show. Thanks for subscribing to the Patreon, and we'll see you in a little bit with Raiders of the Lost Ark. Bye.